These tutorials will teach you the basics for playing Command Combat Civil War. Today is the 6th tutorial, Charging. I'm going to do this one live so I can kind of explain the concepts behind this and why things are. So you can choose to change them if you want. This is the most complicated part of it. It uses all of the different elements of the game. And so if you find some ways that work a little better for you, feel free. There's no little miniature birdie that comes and tells me people are doing it differently from the game. I just want people to have fun with this, and so if there are better ways of doing it, definitely do it, and please let me know as well. But here's the basic concept behind it, and to give you an idea of what the thinking is behind charging this, the American Civil War was a unique period of time for warfare in general, and particularly with charging, because up to this point, there had been hundreds of years of units going up and clashing with each other. The charge had been a hallmark, and this was the one time when the weapons became so accurate and so long range that charging oftentimes wasn't beneficial, and even the close range weapons had just become so deadly that for the most part charging wasn't particularly effective. Units oftentimes, once they learned it, they wouldn't do it again. It just basically was not as major part of a civil war as one might think. Certain generals thought it was, and they certainly tried to make it a big part, but honestly it just didn't happen quite as much and didn't work quite as much as one would think. To give you some idea of this, there were the same number of bayonet wounds in the American Civil War as there were in World War I or World War II. And those are not exactly wars you think of with the bayonet charge. And that's just to give you an idea of what happened with the Civil War. So when they did happen, it wound up being more of a game of chicken, of the two sides, like one side running at one or the other side running at the other, or both charging at each other or whatever, and both waiting for the other one to flinch. And usually somebody would before it actually got to bayonet range for people to stab one another. And so that's why this is so much more based on the morale rather than the actual damage, especially because each one of these stands for between 500 and 1,000 men. So basically whenever you actually take a standoff or even half a standoff, it's a huge amount of damage. But we're going to go ahead and go through the different phases of this, give you some idea. I mean, there's so many different possibilities of things that could happen. There are a lot of things in the book, so I'm only going to go through the basics of this, and then you can go through and see more specifics yourself. And also, if you have questions, put them in the comments below and all that sort of thing. So let's go through all the different phases here. First of all, you have to be in a red order in order to be able to charge. Your division commander has to be in a red order to have that ability to charge. If he's in any other order, he can't do it. Certain commanders have a special ability they could, but in general, he can't. So first thing that happens is you select the unit that is charging and who they are charging. So I'm going to say this one to this one. You do not have to necessarily see the target, but you are going to have to be able to move up to where you can see them, and your normal move will have to be able to go and see them. So let's say there's a hill here. This guy would have to actually be able to move 6 inches to see it in order to even declare the charge. You can't just rely on the roll of how much more movement they're going to have. All right, so he chooses this guy. You first have to roll to see if they're going to charge. So let's say this guy already has like a 3 morale on him. He's going to have to roll above the 3 in order to charge. He rolls a 2, they're not charging. The charge is over, they just basically are staying put. For whatever reason, they delayed. Even having the commander there isn't going to help. He cannot, at this point, lower it. It just basically either they go or they don't. But in this particular case, let's say they don't have anything on them, so they are going to be able to go in there. Also, the division commander is within an inch of them, so he can actually attach himself to the charge if he wants to. In this particular case, let's say he doesn't, but so in the second phase, they rolled morale, or they don't need to roll morale because they don't have it. In fact, you'll actually notice in the book, in the rule book, it says charge phase, under charge phase, and that's where I'm going down. You'll notice that there's an asterisk next to next to certain things. Those things that have an asterisk next to it are not required every single time. There are certain conditions under which they won't. Like, for instance, in this case, roll their morale. Well, they don't have to roll morale. They don't have anything, so they do not have to roll. Now they go into support fire. This stick is actually the range of short range of artillery. You've got two stands here of smoothbore artillery. Now this is one division. Everybody within the division can support. Well, all the artillery in the division can support fire. If there's another division within range, they cannot, unless there is a commander who has a red order next to his artillery. Let's say there's an artillery here from another division, and you have a division commander there who's in a red order. He can actually order that artillery to support fire here. If he is not under red order, or if he's not directly there, he can't. And the reason for that, and there are a number of rules in this game that seem a bit arbitrary, but what they reflect is the idea of command. And other things are happening on the battlefield. They don't have the point of view that we have, looking over the whole thing and being able to be like, oh, well, this should happen, this should happen. Well, it should, but if you have a different division, they're paying attention to what their division is doing, and they're not as much paying attention over here. And also, you're talking about a military command, so people are very rigid, and they're very much of, this is what I'm supposed to do. And that's why I have special rules, because certain commanders would allow certain things. They'd be like, look, just if they need help, go help them or whatever. But most of the time, you're in a very rigid military situation. You're supposed to be only doing what your group is doing. The only the only exception to that is if the commander himself is there going, no, I want to help that division, you support them. So in this particular case, everybody's in the same division. They can all support fire. So you'd have, because you're in close range, and this is smoothbore artillery, you'd have a firepower of 3. By the way, if any of this is confusing about shooting or whatever, this is using all the elements from all the different tutorials. So you might need to look at the other tutorials to understand what I'm talking about. So when I talk about firepower, that's in firing. When I'm talking about movement, it's in moving, etc., etc. Red order versus blue order, that's in command colors. So this is a combination of all of those. So you may need to look at those to understand this. All right, so short range. So firepower of 3, firepower of 3 modified by the wood, so it's 2. Firepower of 3 modified by the wood, so it's 2. So it's 2 and 4. And then you get to do, as long as they are in range and can see the target at the very beginning of the turn, not partway through it, at the very, very beginning of the turn, if they can hit the enemy, then they can do what's called clearing the guns, and they get a firepower of 1 to fire into there. So then you get a 5, and there you go. That's the firepower into them. You do your roll. If you hit, you do damage. If you don't, you don't. But just like in Command Combat Civil War, that 5 now goes back behind them and becomes their morale number. Now in this case, we made them, you can see the blue marker there, that means that they are veteran. So it goes down by 1 to 4. So now you have done support fire. You go on to the next phase, withdrawal, and you'll notice on withdrawal there's an asterisk next to it. That means that it's not every single time. Withdrawal only takes place if the target is cavalry, because cavalry can at that point go, get out of here, and start running. They are not cavalry, so we're not going to do withdrawal. Then the Confederates who are going to be charging are rolling for extra movement. Now notice that the word extra in there. That's not the full distance, it's just the extra movement added to their regular movement. Their movement is 6 because they're infantry, plus they're going to be able to go, it says 3, but it's infantry, so it's 1.5 inches. Cavalry would go 3 inches in that case, but infantry takes it, half of that, so they're going to get 1.5 inches of extra movement, meaning they're getting 7 inches total of movement. Now in this particular case, they're kind of screwed because you'll notice 7 inches does not get them there. So what they are going to end up doing, well actually, 1.5 inches actually. So they would get 6 inches, and then they would get the extra 1.5 inches, so that would bring them right up to here, and they end their movement in disorder because they charged. Anytime you end your charge movement, you wind up in disorder. So they would their charge would end there. In this particular case, let's say they were closer. Or they rolled a little higher. Let's say that they rolled a 7. So get 3.5 extra inches. So they're actually going to be able to make it. We don't actually move them up there yet. But let's say, all right, they got 3.5 extra inches. They're here, so they're getting 9.5 inches of movement. So what you do is you mark the full distance. You see where the 9.5 is? So you're going to mark that. That's as far as they're going, that they have for movement. Doesn't mean they're necessarily going to go that far, but they have that far for movement. Of course, the Union is in the way, but they might not be there the whole time. Now, and in fact, actually, because that's Wood's distance, because Woods would have it, So the distance in the woods would be half, so it would be about to there. So they're basically going to be able to get there. So if the Union troops retreat too far, then they won't be able to get to them. Now, as marking distance, move the normal distance. So they are going to move 6 inches. You do not move your full distance yet. You just move up the 6 inches. And now this is what I was meaning by, if there was a hill in the way, you could move up there, and now you could also, you can still charge. You don't have to see them at the beginning of the movement, but you do have to see them at the beginning of the charge, because at the end of your movement, that's when your charge begins. So right now they've moved, the charge is actually going to begin at this point. However, now the defense rolls morale. Now let's say, before that, when they fired at there, they were supposed to roll to see if they hit the commander. If they rolled a 0, they hit the commander. But let's say they didn't. The Union now rolls. Let's say they roll an 8. They stand tall. They stand tall. If I had rolled a 2, they'd be going back by 2 inches, because 2 is 2 below 4. Actually, an easier one to say. If I had rolled a 1, 1 is 3 below 4, so they'd be going back by 3 inches. And that would put them back here. The Confederates would get up to here, and that would be the end of the charge, because they didn't reach the Union. But in this particular case, they passed their morale. So the Union stays where they are. Now here's where it gets interesting. Let's see here, hold on one second. I was thinking I actually missed a phase here. Oh, okay, here we go. Yeah, I was about to miss something here. So they rolled morale, they passed it. Now there's skirmish, and that's got another star by it. The reason is because you don't usually have a skirmish. If, let's say the Union had a skirmish line there, because you can put one guy up there like that, that would slow the Confederates. They would have to take an extra inch to deal with it, because the skirmishers automatically come back in, but the Confederates would lose an inch. And remember, their final distance is there. If they'd lose an inch, they would come to here, and they would end up like that. Basically, skirmish is really good. Skirmish keeps you from being able to fire very effectively, but it can slow down charges. So if you're more afraid of them charging you than you are than you are concerned with the damage you're going to do to them, you can put skirmishers, or a lot of times people put them on their flank to slow down a cavalry charge that might come on their flank or something like that. So that's the good of skirmishers, and that's what that would be. But in this case, they don't have a skirmish. Now you go to defensive fire. So you got here 1, 2, 3, 4 guys. Their veterans was 5. It's close range, so it's 6. And then you've got artillery here that wants to go into it, and that's a 7, 8, 9. So you are going to put a 9 firepower on them. Now let's say for whatever reason, let's say you would, one of these guys wasn't here for whatever reason, and you have 8 that you're putting onto them. You want that one more thing of firepower to maximize the amount that you can do, because 9 is the maximum you can do to somebody. You want one more piece of artillery. Well, you got one over here, and he's part of the same division, but he's not part of the brigade. Now, the problem with that is that you're in a red order, and you can only bring in artillery from the rest of the division if you're in a blue order. If you're in a blue order, then anybody else in the division, any other artillery in the division, actually anybody else in the division, even infantry, can take place in defensive fire. But if you're in red, it means that they're concentrating on throwing fire out there. Basically, everything in a turn is happening so close to one another. I know it seems like, well, why wouldn't they just do this? Well, it's because the orders had already gotten to them to be on the lookout to fire at something else. And so they're in the process of doing that. Whatever they wind up doing, they are in the process of doing that at the time this takes place. So, because this is a red order, they're kind of doing this. What can I shoot at? What can I shoot at? And so they can't take place in the defensive fire. But in this particular case, we actually have 9, so we're fine with that. But just bear in mind, in defensive fire, only the brigade can take part in defensive fire unless you're in a blue order. So you do that. Of course, they fire, they get a 2, they take out an entire stand. They have just blasted away these Confederates. You'd normally put down some, casualty markers, because that takes part in the final. And so you wind up with the Confederates having this very large morale number on their back. Now, it was 9 firepower with 2 damage, so that goes up to 11, but this doesn't go to 11. This is not Spinal Tap. So they maximize at 9. Their morale maximizes at 9. So they're going to be rolling their morale there. However, before anything else happens, the Union right now can choose to countercharge. Now, they can only countercharge if they are in a red order. That's the advantage of being in red order. You don't get all this other support fire, but you do get the option to countercharge. Now, what happens in a countercharge? Well, basically the same thing as if you were regularly charging. You first have to roll your morale. So let's say you roll a 3. Not going to be able to countercharge, so you just continue with the charge procedure with Confederates continuing to charge. But let's say you rolled well enough, you're going to be able to charge. Ba-ba-da, you go running in, you do not roll, you already rolled the fire, you already rolled morale to go in there. So it basically just goes into reversing. Now the Confederates have to roll their morale. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Now what you do is the Union now rolls to see how much further, because they're going to get 6 inches plus 2 inches, because 4 divided by 2 is 2. So they're going to get 8 inches from where they were, so they're basically going to be going back to here. Now the Confederates roll. They get 9, they go into disorder right where they are. But let's say they had rolled a 7. So they would go back by 2 inches. These are each an inch big, so we know we can do that. So now they're back here, and because they pulled back, they're in disorder. The Union actually technically is still in order. And their maximum distance is here, so they still have movement. So they go right on into them. Now you got melee. And now they rolled, so their morale goes down to 8, whereas because every time you roll, you reduce the number. If you're in disorder, it goes down by 1. If you're in order, it goes down by 2, etc. Let's say the Federals did bring in their general, just so you can get an example of that. All right, so it goes into that. Now we go into melee, and what you do is 1, 2, 3, 4. Basically, what you do is it's as if they're shooting each other, but without any melee, without any terrain, and at close range. So if you were in the woods, normally you reduce by 1, but hey, you're in melee. You're not having to shoot at people behind trees. You're stabbing them around it, so you don't reduce that anymore. In this case, they're out in the open, so it's just normal anyway. But it's at close range. So 1, 2, 3, 4 guys, plus 1 for being close range, plus 1 for being elite or being veteran, plus 1 for having a commander there. So the Union is rolling at a 7. They're needing a 7 or less to do damage. They're getting a 6. They're going to do a half a stand of damage. The Confederates are at 1, 2, 3. They go down 1 for being in disorder, so they are at 2. They need a 2 or less. They have not done. Oh, I'm sorry. They're at close range, so it's 3. So it's 4. Let's see, 2, 3, 2. They're back up to 3. So they still needed. What that was 3 stands in disorder, 2, but they're at close range 3. So they needed 3 or less. They didn't do any. Now that doesn't mean they're not doing any damage at all. Here, I'm going to do this for. Oh, actually no. I have half stands here. This is what it looks like when I have a half a stand. You can do that, or you can just say, okay, there, half the stand is gone. You don't see it because it's behind the paper. But in our case, we actually have a half stand. So let's do this. So they took a little bit of damage. The Union did. I mean, you're in melee, so of course people are getting killed anyway. But it's not enough to show significantly on here. Now you've done. What was it? 7. That would be 7 to their morale, but it's at 8. It maximizes at 9. So there you go. Whereas these guys, they put 3 onto the Union. So now they're both going to roll morale. Now, and by the way, you also roll to see if that guy was hit. And it's a 9 or a 10 when you're in melee, instead of a 10. Instead of just a 0. 3, he did not get hit. So, let's say his command rating is a 3. So he brings this down to a 4. Now that's it. He's not going to be able to use that morale over and over again. If this melee continues, he's just used all of that. But he has to be in this melee now because he started in it. So, anyway. But he does add his command to being able to fight as well. Anyway, alright. So now we're going to roll their morales. You want over a 4 for the Union, and you want over a 9 for the Confederates. The Confederates get an 8. That's 1 below the 9. So they go back by a half. They did not pass it. The Union did. So the Union does not take damage. Confederates do take half a stand, and they pull back. And then both sides are in disorder because they are because they charged, or they were involved in a melee. Now, these two cannot do anything more the rest of this turn because they have been taking part in a charge, any type of charge. Even if the charge doesn't succeed, they were used up. They cannot be used anymore. Same with them. They did defensive fire. Same with these two because they did support fire. So now the charge is ended. So you would think, well, let me make sure that I can explain anything other there. No, actually, that was all that happened. So now you think, okay, well, this tutorial's over. Well, I want to show you one other part of it. So now you have this other unit can still charge. It's their movement now. They can just charge this artillery piece, and there's no defensive fire here because he's already fired. There would be this guy, but you're on a red order, not a blue order, so he can't take part in it. So these guys could just come here, and when you charge artillery, there's defensive fire if they could, but since they can't defensive fire, there is no melee. You touch artillery, it's gone, unless you have a supporting infantry or cavalry within an inch. If these guys were still here, and these guys came up to it, boom, they come in, they're automatically in fire. But they didn't, they countercharged, so these guys can come in and just take this gun. Or the other thing they could do is they could do a movement, because remember, you do not charge from where you are. You can move, and then your charge begins at the end of your movement, so you could charge into them right there. You'd still have to go through all of your phases. Essentially, you would select the unit, charging unit rolls its morale. They would have to roll their morale, but they didn't have any. There'd be support fire. All your support fire is already fired with things. They could empty their guns, which would just be a 1 to hit. Marking the distance is essentially where you're going into them. Now, something to note as well. Notice how when the Union hit the Confederates, after the Confederates pulled back, the Union did not continue. That's because they're infantry. Cavalry would continue attacking them. But in this case, all right, the Confederates would go around. They hit them, or they go around there, move the normal distance. Defense rolls morale. Well, let's say, all right, so their morale is, I forget what it was. Let's say it's 8, and I roll, let's say I roll a 4. They move back 3 inches. They go back like this, and let's say the Confederates have now moved their full distance. Failing their morale actually would save the Union in that case, whereas if they succeeded their morale, they're hit in the flank, and the Confederates are now rolling with 4 units, and the Union, because they are being hit on the flank, are rolling with only 1. So why that? Why would you have it such that you succeed your morale, you get screwed, but you fail at it, you live? Well, when you look at the histories, a lot of times the really brave units, like the Iron Brigade and the Stonewall Brigade, they lost a lot of men because they were so brave. They go in, get into a situation, and oftentimes get wiped out. And you, as the commander, can't stop them necessarily. You might want to go, oh, get back, but they're already committed, and you're not playing the entire army here. You're playing the general. So what do I mean by you are playing the general? Well, I'm glad you asked that, me, because that's the entire concept of command combat Civil War. It's called command combat because the idea is you are playing that general, that corps general, or sometimes even army general, whose only power is to send out commands to his various units and hope that they do the right thing, hope that it's done right, and the entire system is created around this idea of putting things into autopilot as much as possible. So is it frustrating that you have that this artillery is not able to fire in defensive fire because you're in an attack order? Yes, but that would actually be the case if you're out there and you don't have radios. You're relying on sending couriers out, and you don't have time. When they're charging, you don't have time to send an order to an individual artillery battery and say, fire at them. They're already doing what you sent out their orders to do, so they're going to do what they're doing. And sometimes units who you ordered to go in charge, they're involved in that charge, and if they're brave enough, they're going to just stay in that charge and not think about what's happening on their flank, whereas someone who's a little bit more cowardly might actually pull back, and sometimes that was actually the wiser move, somebody being a little bit more cautious was a little bit wiser, because then they were able to be used later, whereas the bravest units were oftentimes wiped out by the end of 1863, and you didn't even see them in 1864. So that is basically the concept. I know it's a bit complicated, and I may alter it in the future, but if you have other ways of doing it, absolutely feel free to do it. And in fact, please, if you have other ways of doing it that are really working for you, put it on the comments here. Put it on the website. You can even email me, Jeff@commandcombat.com. The website is commandcombat.com. I'd love to see them. This is always a developing process. But first and foremost is fun. And so if something works for you, go with what is fun. That's what game designers have always wanted. Well, thank you for watching all of these tutorials. This will be the last one for a while. Watch the other ones to get a better sense of how to play this. And keep on playing Command Combat Civil War. Happy gaming, everybody!